and a consideration for the feelings of others. And it is in sharp contrast with the cruelty of mechanized communication and the tendencies which we have come to note in the modern world. The quantitative pressure of modern knowledge has been responsible for the decay of oral dialectic and conversation. Innes favored the oral tradition for its flexibility, but also understood its limitations, and he notes, I quote again, "An oral tradition implies freshness and elasticity, but students of anthropology have pointed to the binding character of custom in primitive cultures." Now, time binding in oral cultures is entirely dependent on human memory, on collective memory. And memory, it's important to understand, is not a thing. It's not a substance, it's a form of energy, the activity of remembering. But more than that, memory is a performance, an active process of commemoration. To be kept in collective memory, knowledge becomes attached to dramatic narrative and expressed in mnemonic forms such as poetry and song. The singer of tales in an oral culture, having no written text to study, does not have the concept of verbatim memorization that we literates do. So no two oral performances are alike. In fact, the singer is quite willing to vary the performance to accommodate the situation, mood of the audience, and other factors. The multiformity of oral performance is the key to the flexibility of oral tradition, as the tradition, being fluid, can easily adapt to meet changing circumstances. And to give an example, the 12 tribes of ancient Israel are represented in the Bible by the 12 sons of Jacob, each of whom carries the name and is presented as the ancestor of one of the tribes. And this is a common motif in oral cultures. Now, when the Assyrians destroyed the northern kingdom of Israel, 10 of the 12 tribes disappeared, their people presumably killed or enslaved or assimilated. But because the story was part of a written tradition, the 10 lost tribes were never forgotten. Now, by way of contrast, Jack Goody and Ian Watt relate the story of a West African people that told a tale of 7 brothers, each the ancestor of a neighboring tribe. And British researchers recorded the myth early in the 20th century, and no subsequent studies were carried out until 60 years later. During that time, 2 of the tribes disappeared. And the myth had changed accordingly, so that the people now told the story with only 5 brothers instead of 7. Not only was there no acknowledgement that any change had occurred on the part of these peoples, but they insisted that this was the way the story had always been told. Goody and Watt refer to this characteristic of oral cultures as homeostatic. Oral cultures lacking any storage medium outside of human memory practice economy in their time binding and pass on only what is functional, bless you, and useful. Historical and biographical details do not need to be preserved, especially if they're no longer relevant to the present. Oral societies are not bound by the weight of history in the way that our literate societies are. Now, homeostasis is not stasis. It's a dynamic equilibrium evolving, not in the progressive sense that we're accustomed to, not by accumulating increasingly greater amounts of knowledge, nor by making significant technological advancements, but simply by adapting only as much as is needed to maintain a balance in response to changing circumstances. As Walter Ong puts it, oral cultures are conservative or traditionalist. Their main concern is to preserve their precarious hold on whatever knowledge they already have, so they tend to reject innovation and novelty. Members of oral cultures, therefore, live in the present, but they continually look to the past and value the past. They typically talk about a mythic golden age that they long to return to, a time when the world was created, when society was founded, a time of perfect unity and knowledge, like the Garden of Eden. According to Mircea Eliade, they find it relatively easy to move from the profane time of everyday life to a sacred time, one that connects directly to that time of creation. In this sense, oral cultures are certainly pre-scientific, also prehistorical, myth being the content of oral tradition. And my intent is not to suggest that there's something desirable about being pre-scientific or prehistorical, nor do I want to romanticize oral societies, but I think it's important to understand that they represent an ideal of balance that we find both valuable and elusive today. It's that characteristic of flexibility and homeostasis that Innes was hoping to see restored rather than a wholesale return to tribalism. What was it then that pushed us out of balance? It was a complex set of factors, to be sure, but they were all bound up with and bound together by systems of notation and writing. Writing gave us a means to store knowledge outside of human memory, and Korzybski recognized that writing was a necessary prerequisite for a truly progressive form of time binding. But writing also froze language in a relatively permanent form, replacing the flexibility of oral tradition with the rigidity of the fixed text. Homeostasis became harder to achieve when words were written in stone. And it was especially when writing was preserved by durable media such as stone and clay tablets, and later the parchment codex, that the past stopped serving the present, and the present became the servant of the past. This unhealthy fixation with the past is what Innes meant when he wrote about time-biased cultures. On this point, I think Carey did make a mistake, because I believe that Innes didn't intend to categorize homeostatic oral cultures as time-biased. Time bias implies a society that is in disequilibrium, that exhibits an unbalanced obsession with preserving the past. And time bias implies a society that's dominated typically by some form of organized religion. Now, the word religion is worthy of some attention in that it's commonly said to have been derived from the Latin word for binding. Nice coincidence, I thought. Implying a binding of human beings to the gods or God, a binding covenant expressed through ritual and dogma, and also, I think we can say, a binding of time. But no one's entirely sure of what the origins of this word is. They're somewhat mysterious, and Cicero argued for a different derivation, one in which the root meaning of religion is to reread, to read again. Following Cicero, I would suggest that tribal cults turn into religions when their rituals are written down, when the oral performance of ritual drama becomes a strict rereading of a written text, when the flexibility of ritual rooted in oral tradition becomes fixed in the form of the written word. And myth becomes religion when a changing repertoire of songs and stories featuring supernatural agents are written down and canonized as sacred text, formalized and frozen and preserved with great care, often guarded and controlled by some form of priestly class. Complex writing systems such as cuneiform and hieroglyphics and texts written in archaic or dead languages help to enforce priestly monopolies of knowledge, to use the economic metaphor that Innes introduced. And control over these texts, in turn, facilitates priestly control over sacred time, ending easy access to spiritual communion for the rest of the population. Jack Goody explains that the introduction of a sacred text transforms religious experience from a loose set of spiritual practices and beliefs, one that was fluid and flexible, to a set doctrine that all must adhere to. With the sacred text, a line is drawn between the adherents, who are members of the religious grouping, and all the rest, who are unbelievers and infidels. Religion becomes an either-or affair, as in either you swear allegiance on the text and to all that the text contains, or you're an outsider. And if you are a member of our religion, you cannot be a member of another religion. Can't be both at the same time. With a sacred text, conversion becomes conceivable, and so does orthodoxy, fundamentalism, and heresy. Concrete conceptions of the supernatural in which the sacred is immanent, permeating the environment and surrounding us, give way to abstract conceptions in which the supernatural becomes distanced and transcendent, moving first from the earth and water to a mountaintop, from a mountaintop up to the sky, and from the sky up to God knows where. As Innes notes, writing opens the door to monotheism. But even the polytheism of the Greeks and Romans became increasingly more abstract with literacy. With all this in mind, I take the position that there is no such thing as religion without writing, that the myths and rituals and the cults and spirituality of oral cultures do not constitute the specialized institutions and coherent belief systems, bounded and binding, that we define as religion. Now, given that the introduction of writing knocks cultures out of balance, further innovations in writing technology can be seen as an attempt to restore that balance. One example would be the introduction of lightweight and transportable writing surfaces such as papyrus and paper to offset the heavy media of stone, clay tablets, wood, and parchment. Such light media allow for a reliable means of sending messages back and forth over distances and serve the administrative needs of the king and government while also being useful for trade and commerce. Even more significantly, all media that facilitate communication over space are inherently military technologies. The contemporary phrase used for such functions being command and control. In this way, such new forms of writing in the ancient world allowed for the growth of secular sectors of society, and it made it possible for societies to expand beyond local territories into kingdoms and empires. This then results in a new kind of imbalance as the pendulum shifts to the other extreme, and we get the kind of culture that Innes referred to as space-biased. Time remains an important consideration, however, but the need for preservation and durability is replaced by an interest in speed and dissemination. Control also requires coordination and synchronization, which can be best achieved by systems of timekeeping and time-telling, such as the calendar in the ancient world and the mechanical clock in medieval Europe. These technologies, which are based on writing and reading, break time down into identical units, years, days, hours. And as a consequence, our experience of time, our natural experience of time, becomes altered. Edward T. Hall notes that oral cultures are polychronic. That is, members of such cultures see time as heterogeneous in character, continuous and unstructured, and they consequently treat time in a way that is flexible and open to what we call today multitasking. Calendars and clocks move cultures in the direction of the monochronic, in which time is experienced as homogeneous, uniform and repeatable, linear and punctuated, and with that punctuality is valued. And a focused, one thing at a time approach is common. Monochronic cultures reduce the experience of sacred time down to infrequent special occasions, holiday celebrations, while opening the door to the modern metaphor of time as money, and ultimately leading to our contemporary notions of a 24/7 lifestyle. Well, using light and easy-to-use writing surfaces also facilitated copying, which not only undermines the time bias of heavy media, but also restores some of the flexibility of oral tradition, since copying was rarely free from error, and scribes rarely concerned with exact replication of documents. Another set of innovations that served to counter time biases were the simplification of complex writing systems, such as the shift from cuneiform and hieroglyphics to phonetic writing systems, including the alphabet. This in turn led to the mechanization of writing through the invention of the Gutenberg printing press with movable type, and the mass production and distribution of written works gave a great boost to the nascent space bias of Renaissance Europe. Ironically, however fragile and perishable each individual copy of a print medium might be, the production and diffusion of multiple copies of the same text was more effective at preserving knowledge over time than the creation of a single copy in a highly durable medium. But the social and psychological impact was to undermine the time bias associated with the medieval manuscript and break the monopoly of knowledge that the Church of Rome held in Western Europe, which was based on its ownership and scribal copying of parchment manuscripts. The printing of works in contemporary vernaculars rather than Latin and other learned languages further contributed to this process. All of these developments served to democratize writing and reading, and this in turn led to the growth of scholarship, the critical examination of existing traditions, and the growth of knowledge. Alphabetic writing systems are intimately linked to progress in science and mathematics through their particular ability to facilitate logical thinking, analysis, and classification. The technologies of written communication, then, underlie both the conquest of nature and the conquest of peoples. Marxist critics have long noticed the relationship between empiricism in science and imperialism in empires. But there's something more at work here than some conspiracy on the part of the bourgeoisie. We can understand the idea of progress in science and technology best by understanding that progress is a spatial metaphor based on progress as travel across territory. The very idea of progress over time originates as a byproduct of a space-biased culture, and this amounts to a shift in time consciousness. Oral cultures look to the past for legitimacy, for archetypes and models, and long to return to that moment of creation, to that golden age, or at least recover the lost knowledge of their ancestors. But the introduction of writing, especially when coupled with a bias towards space, gradually results in a turn away from the past and towards the future as embodied in the idea of progress. The belief shifts so that we start to think that things are getting better over time. The present is superior to the past, and the best is yet to come. People look forward to things getting better, come to long for the future, and sometimes for utopia. The word old becomes a term of derision, and during the print era, readers turn their attention to two new literary forms, the novel and the news. Perhaps the conceptual shift is best summed up by the change in the meaning of the word original, which once only meant the first and the oldest, coming from the point of origin, the moment of origin in the past, but then comes to mean the newest and most innovative. Now, the spatial imbalance associated with the Egyptian, Alexandrian, and Roman empires in antiquity later manifested in the commercialism, colonialism, and industrialism of modern Europe and America. And Innes was profoundly concerned with the continuing intensification of our space bias brought on by the application of electricity to communications in the form of the telegraph and telephone and broadcasting, which enable us to engage in instantaneous communication over great distances. But he also held out some hope that an acoustic medium like radio might restore some semblance of the oral tradition and thereby help to restore balance to Western societies. We can see in both Innes and Korzybski an attempt to respond to the terrible events of the 20th century, which included the First World War, which is the first war that used weapons of mass destruction, and the rise of communism, fascism, and Nazism, and the Great Depression, and then the Second World War, and the atom bomb, and the Cold War. And can anyone blame them for hoping that it might be time at last for us to enter a new era of sanity and balance? Well, of course, it's easy enough for us to say some 60 years later that Korzybski and Innes were wrong, that the kinds of changes they envisioned never came to pass, but perhaps it's more accurate to say that the changes did come to pass, only not in the ways they had hoped for. Korzybski's dream for a scientific society is not a reality, but we do live in a society guided by the rational principle of efficiency, the foundation of what Neil Postman referred to as technopoly, the surrender of culture to technology. And we turn increasingly greater portions of our affairs over to that supreme engine of mathematical action, the computer. Now, where Korzybski wanted us to be better human beings, we've instead been taking the human element out of the equation and automating the process. And despite Innes's hopes, oral traditions seem more distant than ever before in the age of television and the internet. But we have experienced a continued growth in sonic technologies, which Ong termed secondary orality, an orality quite different from the primary orality of oral cultures. We found a new kind of interactivity made possible by computer-mediated communication, social networking, and social media, which does seem to provide us with some form of communication that resembles orality in some respects, but are a series of updates and comments on Facebook, MySpace, well, not so much anymore, and Twitter, the equivalent of oral dialogue? Does blogging take the place of epic poetry and public address? Can online groups and bulletin boards and instant messaging and YouTube substitute for communities where individuals must cooperate out of necessity in response to the requirements of material reality? Does the ephemeral nature of electronic communications with websites and people's profiles disappearing overnight provide us with the continuity that we so desperately need? In one sense, electronic surveillance and data collection and storage present us with the possibility of balancing the space bias of Western societies with a new form of time binding, one so thorough and complete that it's been dubbed total recall. Does this go so far as to threaten us with a return to a time-biased way of life, one that would support and in fact encourage the various fundamentalist and theocratic movements in existence today? Digital databases are easy enough to alter, it's important to note. Such alterations may be difficult to detect, and in this way, digitality does restore some flexibility, some of the flexibility of orality, perhaps offering some promise for restoring homeostasis, but any digital alterations we may make are not kept in check by a conservative or traditionalist worldview, and therefore it opens the door to relentless revisionism, a kind of temporal anarchy. If there's a potential for homeostasis here, it may be a dystopian balance where, again, the human element has been removed. The flexibility of oral tradition is based on the medium of human memory, the basis of human knowledge. For as Ong reminds us, and as you know every time you take an exam, you know what you can recall. Where oral cultures naturally look to the past and literate cultures have the potential to turn around and look towards the future, our electronic culture seems to be fixated on the present. The instantaneity of telecommunications communicates to us in the present tense. Even when the content is a recording or a film, the broadcast signal, the electronic transmission, creates the message in the present, and there's always the possibility of someone interrupting the broadcast or the transmission to bring us a special message. We're plugged in, we're tuned in, our nervous systems extended in a global embrace, as Marshall McLuhan put it. We're consequently impatient and thrive on the live, the up to the minute, the on demand, the just in time. In our popular culture, our popular therapies and popular spiritualities constantly advise us to live in the moment. And there's some utility to this advice, but it's repeated over and over again. Live in the moment, live in the moment. As if it's some kind of cosmic revelation, rather than a widely shared common sense assumption that's never called into question anymore. Carpe diem, seize the day. That's what Robin Williams says in the Dead Poets Society, which is presented to us as a model of what schooling ought to be and contradicts centuries of our best time-binding efforts. Our present-centeredness is more than a matter of the immediacy of electronic transmission and being online all the time, however, as we have also sought to bring the past and the future under the control of the present. Computer programming and digital technologies blur the once clear distinction between a performance and its recording. A program does not play back a performance. It's a performer in its own right, producing an automated performance. Each performance, each time you play it, it's a new performance, but one that was constructed in the past, programmed in the past, and each performance is identical to every previous performance and every performance that will ever be repeated. The programmed performance brings the past into the present, not as a recorded artifact, but as an event newly created each time. This not only brings the past into the present, but also the future into the present. The program is an attempt to colonize the future on the part of the present. Programming the future should not be confused with planning for the future, which is what we did when we were forward-looking. Planning involves contingencies and uncertainties, and certainly children today know the difference between making plans to play after school and the kind of programmed afternoon activities that they're often involved in. Programming is not so much about progress as it is about controlling the future, not so much about continuity as it is about uniformity and eliminating uncertainty. We live in a long now that extends far into our past and that we're trying to extend far into our future. The problem with programming the future as opposed to planning for it is that programming is, again, an attempt to eliminate human judgment, to bring the future into the present by means of a hyper-rationality, just as we bring the past into the present by means of a hyper-reality. In one sense, we could see in some semblance of a new kind of sacred time, perhaps a present in which all times past and future intersect. But in another sense, we wind up with a completely profane time, 24/7, completely uniform. We're losing the distinction between sacred and profane time. And we're really, one of the things we're losing are our much-needed Sabbaths. Just take a break. We're losing the distinction between night and day. We're losing our sense that to everything there is a season. We're losing our past then, and as we're losing our future. And having said all that, I don't want you to think I believe that all is lost, although Alfred Korzybski's dream of training people to think and act with enhanced rationality never quite materialized. I do think we've seen great success in the effort to combat the irrationality of stereotyping and prejudice, an area where Korzybski's general semantics has made significant contributions. And while we have yet to achieve the flexibility and balance that is valued, we have become more concerned with homeostasis, more ecologically minded in many ways, especially in regard to the natural environment. There's no question that we still need to make much more progress in these areas, but following the advice of the general semanticist Wendell Johnson, we also need to recognize and celebrate the progress that we have achieved, and we have achieved very significant progress. Korzybski and Innes represent different concepts of time, different positions on how human beings ought to relate to time, but they are in many ways quite complementary. Korzybski valued progress, and I've argued that we need to retrieve and reclaim that word and stop feeling embarrassed about using it. But we have to bring back the idea of progress in the holistic sense that Korzybski asked for, not as applied to specialized sectors of society related to science and technology. We have to insist that it can only be called progress if it includes social, political, and economic progress, and moral, ethical, and ecological progress. At the same time that we need to move forward, we need to regain and then maintain our balance. We need a balance between progress and continuity, between the individual and the community, between the profane and the sacred, between science and religion, between technology and ecology, between space and time. We need to put an end to the tyranny of the now. This means that we have to actively counter the biases of our contemporary electronic media environment. Along these lines, Neil Postman argued that schools ought to be carrying out a thermostatic function, a cybernetic function, countering the dominant biases of society in order to help us find homeostasis. That means reinforcing both orality and literacy in the face of digitality. And it means that we need to teach history as a coherent narrative, or set of narratives that help us to contextualize the present, that shows the progress and the backtracking, the discoveries and the mistakes, the good and the evil, so we can understand ourselves as a species in time. And this includes the history of communication and the arts, the religions, the philosophies, the sciences, and the technologies. And we need to teach the history of the future. There is a history of the future. And to look at the future of the future, futurism, not as they mean it today about being about entrepreneurial efforts and the introduction of new products, but about planning and conserving, about preserving and preparing for the generations to come, about achieving and maintaining sustainability, about pondering the impact and effects of innovations, and the fact that change, whenever we introduce changes, they're all to be approached with great care. The past and the future need to be in balance with one another, with the present serving as an appropriate fulcrum between the two. And as James Carey would advise us, we need to bring our time into balance and to do so on a human scale. We exist only because we're riding on that big bang that happened some 14 billion years ago. We're alive because we're riding on a second big bang that occurred about 4 billion years ago on this planet, the origin. To talk about it because we're riding on a third big bang that occurred maybe 40,000 years ago or so, with the beginnings of language and symbolic communication, and with it, time binding. As a species, we are binders of time, bound up by our biases of time. We're moved by our consciousness of time. As we tell time, only time will tell. As we play for time, as we pray for time.